The letter had been sitting on the polished granite counter for 3 days, unopened. Plain ivory envelope, hand-addressed in a delicate script to Mrs. Eleanor Grant. No return address. Every time Eleanor walked past it, her chest tightened. It felt like something radioactive, like if she opened it, everything she had built over the past 2 decades might collapse. She had been knee-deep in final preparations for her 20th wedding anniversary celebration with Victor, a renowned cardiologist and the man she had stood beside through med school, residency, and the climb to his current success. But lately Victor had become distant. Too many late nights, too many conferences. He blamed administrative duties and urgent surgeries, but she knew something was off. On Tuesday morning, while sipping her coffee, Eleanor finally tore the envelope open. The smell of an expensive floral perfume hit her first, and her stomach churned before she'd read a single word. Dear Mrs. Grant, the letter began in graceful, almost lyrical handwriting. You don't know me, but I've known your husband intimately for the past 11 months. The porcelain mug slipped from Eleanor's fingers and shattered against the kitchen tile. Tiles Victor had chosen during their last renovation. Coffee splashed across her linen robe and bare legs, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't take her eyes off the pages in her hand. 3 handwritten sheets. The woman, who signed her name as Celeste, recounted their first meeting at a health tech summit in Vancouver. She described how Victor had removed his wedding band before introducing himself at the hotel bar, and how the conversation turned flirtatious in minutes. Eleanor's chest tightened with every detail. The trips he said were work retreats were actually weekend getaways with Celeste. She wrote of the promises Victor made to leave his wife after the anniversary fuss. She wrote of the names he called Eleanor in private: cold, controlling, obsessed with appearances. But I've seen your photos. I've read your blog, Celeste wrote. He lied to both of us. You deserve to know. The final page was full of intimate details. Habits, scars, birthmarks, and phrases he used in bed. Proof. Eleanor folded the pages with trembling hands, each crease sharper than the last. Her mind spun. She tried to focus on the logical things. Guest lists, catering, floral arrangements. In 4 days, over 150 guests would arrive for the vow renewal. Family, Victor's hospital colleagues, her own friends from the literary circle she used to lead before motherhood and marriage. Childhood friends flying in. Neighbors. The house would be full. The celebration, supposedly a culmination of 2 decades of love and resilience, now felt like a stage play in which she was the last to read the script. She walked through the grand house she had decorated herself. 4,200 square feet of symmetry and style, always clean, always camera-ready for Victor's public image. She paused at the wall of framed photos in the hallway. So many smiling moments, so many lies. She had hosted dozens of fundraisers and dinners here, always smiling beside him. She had shelved her dreams of publishing fiction, playing support act to a man who had told her, kindly but firmly, "Your time will come after the kids are older." Her fingers hovered over her phone for a full minute before dialing. "Nina," she said, trying to sound steady. "Could you come over? I need help with something for the party." Nina, her best friend since college, was at her door within an hour. Eleanor said nothing at first. She simply laid the letter out on the marble island. Nina read in silence, her expression shifting from shock to fury to deep sadness. "That bastard," she said finally, her voice tight with emotion. I'm so sorry." Eleanor nodded. "I'm not canceling the party," she said. Nina blinked. "Wait. What?" Eleanor looked at her with clear, icy resolve. "There will be a ceremony. Just not the one he's expecting." Nina's eyes widened. "You're planning something, aren't you?" Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't have to. The room felt different, charged like the air before a thunderstorm. The rest of that day was a blur of memories flooding in. Eleanor remembered the time she found a long red hair on Victor's scarf. He claimed it was from the new research assistant. A strange charge on the credit card from a boutique she'd never visited. "A surprise for your birthday," he had said. That birthday passed without a gift. The more she thought, the more she saw. His phone, once left carelessly on counters, now locked. The sudden overseas conferences. His dismissive comments when she talked about writing again. "You need a little project," he'd told her. "But don't stress yourself." She saw it now, how over the years she had been gently, expertly diminished. Her voice softened, her fire put out. "Not anymore," she whispered to herself. The next morning, Eleanor woke with purpose. Victor had already left for the hospital, as usual. She dressed simply. Black trousers, a crisp blouse, and drove to St. Andrew's Medical Center where Victor served as chief of cardiology. She knew his surgery schedule by heart. He'd be in the operating room for hours. At the reception desk, she smiled at Mira, the administrative assistant who always greeted her warmly. "Dr. Grant's in surgery until noon," Mira said, standing. "Would you like me to let him know you stopped by?" Eleanor shook her head. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you. Could we speak in private?" Mira tilted her head curiously but gestured to her small office. As Eleanor closed the door, she pulled out her calmest voice. "I need a favor. For our anniversary, Victor said he wants to mention his Vancouver presentation. But he misplaced the details. Could you pull the files for me? Dates, hotel registration, anything you've got." Myra's smile faltered. She hesitated a second too long. "Vancouver?" she echoed, turning to her computer. "That was last September, right?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, he said it was one of his best talks. He also mentioned someone named Celeste, said she helped with prep. Maybe I should mention her in the speech." Myra's fingers stopped typing. She swallowed. "Celeste. I don't remember anyone by that name," she said too carefully. Eleanor watched her eyes. The room felt tight with tension. After a moment, Mira printed 3 documents and handed them over. "I hope this helps," she said. Then, as Eleanor turned to leave, she added softly, "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. Mira knew. Eleanor sat in her car staring at the hotel invoice. Victor had stayed in Vancouver 3 extra nights beyond the conference. 2 room service breakfasts, spa receipt, a bottle of champagne charged at midnight. It was all there. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, her hands shaking. That evening, Victor came home later than usual. He looked tired, distracted. Eleanor met him at the door with a glass of bourbon, his favorite, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How's your speech coming?" she asked. "I've been polishing mine all day." He chuckled, loosening his tie. "Still working on it. You know me, not much of a writer." Eleanor tilted her head. "Funny, Celeste says otherwise." His glass paused midway to his lips. His smile stiffened. "Celeste, your research assistant. From Vancouver." A flicker of panic passed across his face, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, that's Celeste. I'd forgotten she was there." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Of course." She excused herself, claiming exhaustion. Upstairs, in their shared bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed, listening to Victor's muffled voice downstairs. He was on the phone, and though she couldn't hear the words, she knew who he was calling. She imagined him spinning new lies, trying to cover up old ones. Her gaze settled on the framed photo on her nightstand, a wedding picture from 2 decades ago. She hardly recognized the hopeful young woman smiling in white. Lying beside Victor that night, Eleanor realized something profound. The fear that had gripped her heart for years, fear of being alone, of losing him, of losing the life they'd built, was gone. It had been replaced by something clearer. Determination. At sunrise, Eleanor put her plan into motion. While Victor showered, she quietly copied Celeste's letter, then placed the original inside a sealed folder and locked it in her bank's safety deposit box. She wasn't taking any chances. She texted Nina. "Change of plans. I need you to call every guest. Don't cancel. Just tell them this is a ceremony they'll never forget. Especially the hospital board." Nina didn't ask questions. She only replied, "On it." After Victor left for work, Eleanor drove across town to the office of Professor Malcolm Reed, a retired law professor and longtime family friend. Years ago, she'd edited his memoir for a university press, before Victor convinced her to stop freelancing and focus on the family. Malcolm greeted her warmly but furrowed his brow as she laid everything out: Celeste's letter, the gaslighting, the finances. He convinced me to combine accounts. Said it would be more efficient, Eleanor said bitterly. Malcolm leaned forward, listening intently. Did you know Victor came to me 2 months ago asking how to change beneficiary forms? Eleanor blinked. He what? Said you both wanted to make the HeartLife Foundation the primary recipient of your insurance and pensions. I told him both parties had to be present. He seemed disappointed. Eleanor's stomach dropped. I never agreed to that. Malcolm closed his laptop gently. You're not the first woman I've helped in this situation. But if you want to come out of this standing, we need a strategy. Starting with financial protection. Over the next hour, he laid out her rights, what she was entitled to, and what she should gather. Eleanor left his office with a folder full of legal notes and a firm plan. Step 1. Expose the truth. Step 2. Protect herself. Step 3. End the performance. Later that afternoon, she met with Dr. Lyra Monroe, chief of surgery at Victor's hospital. Eleanor had always admired Lyra from afar, though Victor had warned her she was difficult and career-obsessed. Lyra welcomed her into her office with a curious smile. Mrs. Grant, what brings you here? Eleanor didn't waste time. Lyra, I need to speak with you privately. It's about Victor. She recounted only what Lyra needed to know. Celeste, the financial deceit, the offshore transfers. Lyra's expression never wavered, but her grip on her pen tightened. I had my suspicions, she admitted. Especially after the Argyle Grant paperwork. There were inconsistencies Victor never explained. Eleanor sat up straighter. What inconsistencies? He claimed to have co-led a clinical trial that doesn't exist. And the grant requires full disclosure, especially financials. Eleanor thought of the quiet bank transfers she'd spotted last month. Lyra leaned in. The hospital board will be at your ceremony, including Nolan Argyle himself. Eleanor smiled thinly. Good. The final phone call was the hardest. Eleanor dialed her parents, who adored Victor like a son. Her voice faltered only once as she explained the truth. There was a long silence. Then her mother whispered, "Oh, Elle," and her father, ever the stoic, simply said, "We're on the next flight. Tonight. You won't go through this alone." "I'm not canceling," Eleanor reminded them gently. "I need you there. I need you beside me when I speak." "You have us," her mother promised. "No matter what." That evening, Eleanor stood in front of her vanity, brushing her hair. In the mirror, she saw a woman who looked older, wiser, and somehow more whole than she had in years. When Victor entered and wrapped his arms around her, she didn't flinch. "You look beautiful," he murmured. "I've been working on my vows," she said, locking eyes with him in the glass. "I think people will be surprised." The next morning arrived clear and bright, too perfect for a day built on buried truths. Victor was unusually attentive, fluttering around the house, offering her breakfast, checking in about the schedule. Eleanor watched him closely. Did he know? Had Celeste warned him? He acted as if everything were normal, his usual mask of charm and control firmly in place. Nina arrived with a team of stylists. "Everyone's confirmed," she whispered. "The board, his colleagues, that smug rep from Pharma. And yes, Celeste RSVP'd this morning." Eleanor's heart kicked against her ribs, but her hands stayed steady. The stylist pinned up her hair while makeup was brushed on in layers. By 3:30 they arrived at the venue. Victor went ahead to mingle, while Eleanor waited in the bridal suite, reviewing everything. The letter, financial documents, and screenshots she'd retrieved from Victor's forgotten backup cloud. The ceremony was set in the garden of the country club where they'd married 20 years earlier. Chairs faced a floral arch, and guests filled the seats with anticipation. The music began at precisely 4 p.m. Eleanor walked alone down the aisle. Her gown was soft gold, her steps graceful. Victor stood waiting with a practiced smile, hands outstretched. In the third row sat Nolan Argyle. To his left, Dr. Lyra Monroe. She spotted Mira, Malcolm, and even Celeste, seated discreetly in the back, her blonde hair unmistakable. The officiant began. Today we gather to witness the reaffirmation of vows between Victor and Eleanor Grant. A celebration of 20 years of commitment, love, and fidelity. Eleanor almost laughed. Victor was glowing proud. "Victor," the officiant said, "please share your vows." Victor read from a folded paper, voice rich with sincerity. He spoke of partnership, sacrifice, and devotion. His performance was flawless. People wiped their eyes. Eleanor did not. The officiant turned toward Eleanor. "And now, Eleanor, your vows." She stepped forward, not toward Victor, but toward the guests. From her clutch, she pulled out a set of folded notes. Not the neat vow cards Victor had seen her rehearsing earlier, but the copy of Celeste's letter. The breeze fluttered its edges. "I was going to write something traditional," she began, voice clear and firm. "But I received a letter that gave me a more honest summary of our marriage than I ever could have written myself." Victor frowned slightly, his smile faltering. A few guests exchanged confused looks. Eleanor continued. "It begins, dear Mrs. Grant. You don't know me, but I've known your husband intimately for the past 11 months. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Victor's eyes widened. "Eleanor!" he hissed under his breath, stepping toward her. "Don't." But she held up a hand and kept reading. Her voice didn't tremble. If anything, it grew stronger with each word. She read aloud the passages detailing the Vancouver affair, the romantic getaways disguised as medical conferences, the promises Victor made to leave his wife after the party. Guests froze in stunned silence. Some looked at Victor. Others stared at the ground. Victor reached forward, trying to grab the letter. "That's enough," he snapped. But before he could touch her, 2 figures stepped between them. Malcolm and Eleanor's father. "Let her finish," her father said calmly, though his voice shook with rage. Eleanor looked at Victor directly. "Would you like to explain to our guests, Victor? Or should I continue?" Victor stared at her, jaw clenched, hands balled into fists. His mask was gone. "The woman you all know as my husband," Eleanor said, addressing the crowd now, "has spent the last year lying to me, and to many of you. But it wasn't just an affair. It was deception layered over years of quiet control." She turned toward Nolan Argyle and the hospital board. "There are discrepancies in the Argyle grant files. You may want to investigate those. And the offshore transfers from our joint accounts. He has the details." Gasps gave way to murmurs. Nolan's brow furrowed, and he leaned toward Lyra, whispering. Victor looked like he might bolt. "One more thing," Eleanor added. "To the woman who sent me this letter, Celeste, thank you." She looked to the back row where Celeste sat pale but still. "You didn't break my marriage. You helped me see the truth." Celeste nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. The officiant stood frozen. The guests were speechless. Then Nina walked up, heels clicking against the stone path, and gently took the letter from Eleanor's hands. "We'll take it from here," she said quietly. Eleanor turned back to Victor one last time. "I stayed silent for too long. I lost parts of myself in your shadow. But not anymore." She stepped off the platform and walked straight down the aisle, guests parting to let her pass. Some avoided her eyes. Others reached out with trembling hands. But she didn't stop until she was out of sight. Behind her, she heard the officiant finally speak. "This concludes today's gathering." Eleanor smiled to herself. A gathering. Not a celebration. Not anymore. Back in the bridal suite, Eleanor stood alone, breathing deeply. Her heart pounded, not with fear but with release. Outside, guests were filing out in stunned silence. Some offered awkward hugs to Victor. Others avoided him entirely. She heard Malcolm speaking firmly with the hospital board. Nina appeared moments later, a triumphant glint in her eye. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." Eleanor turned to her friend. "I didn't think I'd feel this calm." "That's what happens when you reclaim yourself," Nina said. "You stopped surviving and started living." Eleanor changed into a simple navy dress she had packed in a tote bag, just in case. Gone was the gold gown. Gone was the woman trying to preserve appearances. She was done with facades. Done with Victor's version of her life. She would write her own story now. As they exited the country club, Nina's arm looped through Eleanor's, the evening sun casting long shadows. Reporters had already begun gathering at the gates, tipped off by someone. Perhaps Mira, perhaps even Celeste. Eleanor kept her chin high. She had nothing to hide. A young journalist with a press badge approached. "Mrs. Grant, any comment about the incident?" Eleanor smiled. "It wasn't an incident. It was a beginning." She left it at that. Nina chuckled as they got into the car. "They're going to write about this for weeks." "Let them," Eleanor replied. "It'll be the first time my name is in the news without standing behind Victor's." The two women drove off as cameras flashed behind them. That night, Eleanor stayed at her parents' house. They had insisted. Her mother prepared tea and blankets, her father stayed quietly nearby, watching over her like when she was a child with nightmares. "We're proud of you," he said simply. "You didn't just speak. You roared." Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder for a moment, letting herself feel the safety she hadn't known she missed. Upstairs, she opened her laptop and stared at a blank document. Then she began to type. "The day the curtain fell." The words poured out. Her marriage, the betrayal, the gaslighting, the rediscovery. For hours she wrote. By dawn, she had the first 3 chapters of a memoir she hadn't known she was ready to write. Victor, meanwhile, was unraveling. The hospital launched an immediate review into the Grant files. The board placed him on administrative leave. Celeste had shared additional emails and receipts with Nolan Argyle after the ceremony. Eleanor didn't ask for updates. She didn't need to. Mira texted her later. "Heads are spinning. People are choosing sides. But most are on yours." Eleanor responded simply, "Thank you for everything." Celeste messaged too. "I'm sorry for what I was part of. I believed him. I didn't know about the finances." Eleanor replied, "You gave me the truth. That was enough." Then she muted the thread. The past had spoken. Now it was time to walk forward. Within a week, Eleanor met with Malcolm again to finalize her financial protections. The forensic accountant had uncovered enough to press charges, but Eleanor chose a quieter path. She didn't want courtrooms or chaos, just closure. "We'll file for divorce with a full split of assets," Malcolm confirmed. "You'll keep the house, your name, and everything you brought in." Eleanor nodded. "And he won't contest it. Not after what came out." Malcolm smiled faintly. "You're stronger than you know." "No," Eleanor said. "I just finally stopped pretending I wasn't." With the legal steps underway, she turned her attention back to writing. Her memoir had caught the interest of a publisher she once freelanced for. The title remained the same, The Day the Curtain Fell. A month later, Eleanor stood in her living room, hers now fully, and stared out at the garden where she'd once imagined grandchildren playing. The pain still flickered, but it was no longer paralyzing. She had changed the locks, painted the walls, hung new art. Her parents visited weekly. Nina brought wine and manuscript notes. She was rebuilding piece by piece on her own terms. And as she sat down to write that morning, she knew her story was far from over. It was just starting to get good. The weeks that followed surprised Eleanor more than the anniversary itself. She had braced for judgment, whispers, or even backlash. But instead she found quiet respect. Messages trickled in from unexpected places. The wife of one of Victor's colleagues wrote, "I wish I had your courage. I'm still pretending." An old college friend said, "Your speech gave me chills. I played it back 3 times." Even her former editor emailed, asking if she'd consider a column about reclaiming identity after betrayal. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She needed to think, not about whether she could, but whether she wanted to be known in that way. Not as the woman who exposed her husband, but as the writer who found her voice again. Victor, now suspended from the hospital, moved into a condo across town. He sent a formal letter through his attorney expressing regret and proposing a quiet settlement. Eleanor signed it without a word. He called once, just once. She let it ring. Whatever words he had now, they were 20 years too late. Nina later told her that Celeste had also left town, perhaps seeking a fresh start. Eleanor didn't blame her. Sometimes the only way forward was away. That night, Eleanor poured herself a glass of wine and walked through each room of the house alone. Not with grief, but with gratitude. "This is mine now," she whispered. "My story. My space." The garden bloomed early that spring, and Eleanor took it as a sign. She started each morning with coffee and journaling under the old sycamore tree. At first, the words were messy and tangled, bits of hurt, fragments of rage. But eventually they began forming something cleaner, purposeful. She started structuring her memoir into chapters, building a rhythm. Morning walks, writing from 9 to noon, editing in the afternoons. Her therapist, whom she had started seeing weekly, encouraged this routine. "You're not just processing," Dr. Lena said during one session. "You're building." And Eleanor smiled. Because for the first time in years, that's exactly what she was doing, building herself back, not to what she was, but to who she was meant to be. One afternoon, while browsing a local bookstore, Eleanor found herself drawn to a group of women gathered in the reading corner. A sign beside them read, "Women Who Write, Memoir Circle, Thursdays at 4 p.m. Curious, she lingered near the shelf until one of them, a woman with short curls and a vibrant scarf, looked up and smiled. "You thinking of joining?" Eleanor hesitated. "Maybe. I used to write. I'm trying again." The woman nodded warmly. "Then you're exactly who we need." That Thursday, Eleanor returned with her laptop and a printed chapter. As she read aloud, voices murmured encouragement. "That line," one said. "It hit me." Another added, "You wrote my life and didn't even know it." Eleanor blinked back tears. She wasn't just healing. She was helping others find their way too. The memoir circle became her anchor. They met weekly, sometimes longer than planned, sharing tea, tears, and sentences raw with memory. Eleanor found herself laughing again. Real laughter, not the kind she had forced for years at Victor's side. One evening after a session, she sat in her car, watching the sunset paint the sky with oranges and golds. She picked up her phone and called her mother. "I think I'm happy," she said, surprised by her own words. "Not every minute. But I feel real again." Her mother exhaled on the other end. "That's all I've ever wanted for you, Elle. You've always been strong. Now you're free too." In May, the publisher she'd once freelanced for officially offered her a book deal. The manuscript would be part of their summer memoir line, published under the title she had written that first night, "The Day the Curtain Fell." Her editor called it fierce, elegant, and unflinching. Eleanor held the contract in trembling hands, her eyes welling, not from fear but from fulfillment. "You ready to be public again?" the editor had asked. Eleanor had paused. "Not as someone's wife. Just as myself." "Good," the editor said. "That's the woman people want to read." That evening, she celebrated with Nina and her parents. There was no champagne toast. Just chocolate cake, laughter, and a piece that couldn't be bought. One Saturday, Eleanor attended a local book festival as a panelist. The topic was truth in memoir, writing from the ashes. She sat beside authors she had once admired from afar. When it was her turn to speak, she scanned the room. The chairs were full. Women, men, young, old, all leaning forward. "Writing truthfully," she said, "means pulling your story out from where it was buried. Sometimes that means digging through grief, betrayal, or silence. But on the other side of that pain is freedom. Applause filled the space. Afterward, dozens approached to thank her, to share their own stories, some still whispering them as if afraid to speak too loud. Eleanor listened to everyone, because she knew exactly what it took to say the first sentence out loud. That summer, Eleanor traveled to Scotland, then Portugal, and later Costa Rica. Not to run from anything, but to stand in her own story wherever it took her. She wrote in cafes, on beaches, even at airports during long layovers. Her second book was already taking shape. Not a memoir, but fiction inspired by truth. She wasn't writing to escape anymore. She was writing to imagine. On a warm evening in Lisbon, she sat at a rooftop bar, sketching a character who walked away from a golden cage with nothing but a journal and her name. Eleanor closed her notebook and smiled. She didn't just get out. She had arrived. In September, the first print copies of The Day the Curtain Fell arrived. She opened the box alone in her study, surrounded by notes, drafts, and red-marked pages. Holding the finished book was like holding her heart outside her chest. She ran her fingers over the cover, bold serif letters, a faded wedding arch in the background. Her name, just hers, printed beneath the title. That evening, her parents brought flowers. Nina brought champagne. They toasted not just the book, but the journey. To Eleanor, Nina said. To the woman who wrote her way free. Eleanor laughed, cheeks flushed. And to the next story, she added. Because she knew now, there would always be more. A few weeks later, Eleanor walked into a bookstore to see her book on display. A staff member was arranging a table titled, Voices That Rose. Her book was at the center. As she turned to leave, a young woman approached shyly. Are you the author? Eleanor smiled. I am. The woman clutched a copy of the book. I just wanted to say, thank you. I'm in something right now, and reading this, it made me feel less alone. Eleanor's throat tightened. She reached out and gently touched the woman's shoulder. You're not alone, she said. And someday you'll tell your story too. The woman nodded, tears brimming. Eleanor stepped outside into the golden afternoon light, her heart full. This was why she'd spoken up, why she'd kept going. As fall settled in, Eleanor's days were filled with book events, radio interviews, and emails from readers around the world. Some shared their own stories of betrayal. Others thanked her for giving them the strength to leave, to speak, to heal. Her publisher arranged a short tour through major cities: Chicago, Atlanta, Seattle. In each one, Eleanor stood on small stages and shared not just her story, but what came after. People ask me if I'm angry, she said during a Q&A in Boston. The truth, it was, but now I'm free. And that's better than revenge. After every event there were hugs, handshakes, tears. She carried each one home like a thread in a new tapestry she hadn't known she was weaving. At one event in D.C., she was approached by a tall woman in a navy blazer who introduced herself as a professor of women's studies. We've added your memoir to our syllabus, the woman said. Our students are having the most honest conversations we've seen in years. Eleanor blinked. My story. The woman smiled. Yes, 'cause it's not just yours. It's ours. It's the story of silence breaking. That night, in her hotel room, Eleanor sat by the window and watched the Potomac shimmer. She thought of that envelope that had once sat untouched on her kitchen counter. How it had detonated her old life and birthed a new one. You were a warning, she whispered into the night. But also a gift. Back home, Eleanor settled into a rhythm again. Only this time it was hers entirely. Mornings belonged to writing. Afternoons to walks or book club meetings. Evenings to herself. She had redecorated the master bedroom, replacing every trace of Victor with art she loved and soft amber lighting. She even repainted the walls a calming sage green. One evening, while rearranging her bookshelf, she found one of Victor's old medical textbooks with his handwritten notes still inside. She held it a moment, considering whether to toss it or burn it. Instead, she placed it in a donation box. Let it be someone else's lesson, she said aloud. The past didn't scare her anymore. It had already taught her everything she needed. Nina visited often, now that her own kids were older. The two of them spent long afternoons cooking, laughing, sometimes crying when memories surfaced uninvited. "I still can't believe you stood up there and read that letter," Nina said one day while they peeled apples for pie. Eleanor smiled. "I wasn't sure I could. But then I thought if I don't speak, who else will feel trapped?" Nina nodded slowly. "You started a ripple." "Maybe," Eleanor said. "Or maybe I just dropped a stone and let the water move." That evening they sat under twinkling garden lights and toasted to starting over, to courage, to truth, however inconvenient it might be. One weekend in October, Eleanor received an invitation to speak at a retreat in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The theme, rebirth after silence. First she hesitated. The idea of spending 3 days with strangers, unpacking trauma, seemed exhausting. But something in her nudged her forward. When she arrived, she was greeted by women of all ages, some shy, some fierce, all carrying their own invisible histories. The retreat was raw, beautiful, full of shared tears and spontaneous laughter. During her session, Eleanor read a chapter about the moment she left the ceremony alone. The room was still. When she finished, a woman in the front row whispered, "That gave me permission." Eleanor blinked rapidly, her voice tight. Then it was worth it. That retreat changed something in her. Eleanor began considering what came next, not just for her writing, but for her life. She had been so focused on healing, surviving, and rebuilding that she hadn't allowed herself to imagine new dreams. During one quiet hike at the retreat, she stood at the edge of a ridge, wind brushing her face. She imagined opening a small writer's lodge, something intimate, quiet, a sanctuary for women like her. Writers who had voices, but no space to use them. That night, back at the lodge, she sketched out ideas in her journal. The scriptorium, she titled it. A place for women to write the truth they were once afraid to speak. Upon returning home, she couldn't shake the vision. She reached out to Malcolm, her longtime legal guide and friend, to ask about purchasing a small property. "You're really doing this," he said with a grin. "I'm really doing this," Eleanor replied. She found a cozy lakeside cabin on the outskirts of town, nestled among tall oaks and quiet trails. It was run down but charming, and she knew instantly. It was perfect. Within weeks, contractors were at work. Eleanor visited every day, sometimes just to stand inside the future she was building. She painted the first wall herself, in a warm shade of terracotta, music playing softly as she worked. She hadn't felt this kind of joy in years. Not since long before Victor. By winter, the scriptorium was nearly complete. A modest 3-bedroom retreat with a communal writing room, fireplace, kitchen, and a shelf that would soon hold books written within its walls. She opened applications for the first residency in January, offering 2-week stays for women ready to reclaim their voices. Within days, she received over 80 submissions. Eleanor read each one, heart swelling at the courage in every paragraph. She chose 5 women for the first cohort, diverse ages, backgrounds, and stories. When they arrived in early February, nervous and wide-eyed, Eleanor greeted them with tea, blankets, and the words, "This is your space. Say whatever you need to say." Those first 2 weeks were magical. The women wrote feverishly, shared readings by the fire, and cried together as long-buried truths came to the surface. Eleanor cooked simple meals, left chocolate on their pillows, and listened without judgment. On the final night, they sat in a circle and each woman read a single page from her new work. One was about surviving abuse. Another about walking away from a life she didn't choose. When it was Eleanor's turn, she read from a fictional story she'd been quietly shaping. It wasn't about Victor. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about a girl who built her own home in the woods and filled it with her voice. The circle was silent. Then someone whispered, "That's you." And Eleanor smiled. "Maybe it is." After the women left, Eleanor walked through the now empty house. It felt fuller somehow, not emptier. Full of words and healing and possibility. She sat by the fire with a journal and wrote, "This is not the end. This is the legacy." That night, she dreamed not of what was lost, but of everything still to come. She dreamed of letters, hundreds of them, not filled with betrayal but with bravery. She dreamed of stories being born in every corner of her retreat, of truth spoken and heard. And when she woke, she knew one thing for certain. She had not just reclaimed her life. She had created something bigger than herself. Spring returned with soft breezes and blooming dogwoods, and with it came a new rhythm to Eleanor's life. The scriptorium welcomed its second residency group in March. 6 women this time, including a retired schoolteacher, a divorce attorney turned poet, and a university student who had left an abusive household. Eleanor no longer felt like just a host. She felt like a steward of voices, a guardian of untold truths. "You built a place where we're allowed to matter," one of the women told her. Eleanor never forgot those words. She wrote them on a sticky note and placed it on the mirror in her writing studio. Some mornings, when doubt whispered in her ear, she read it again and remembered why she had begun. Media interest in Eleanor's work never fully faded. Occasionally, a podcast or magazine would feature her, and every time she spoke not of betrayal but of recovery. "The infidelity was only a spark," she told one interviewer. "The real story is what I found beneath the ashes." Her words resonated, and invitations to speak at retreats, women's conferences, and universities continued to roll in. But Eleanor was selective now. She said yes only when it felt right. Her time was precious. Every hour devoted to writing, healing, or mentoring meant something. She no longer filled her calendar to prove her worth. Her worth was inherent. Quiet days at the lake were now her favorite. Bird's tea and a blank page. Victor tried once more to contact her that spring. A handwritten letter arrived at the scriptorium addressed in the familiar, overly tidy script he used when trying to impress. She stared at it for a full minute before sliding it, unopened, into her desk drawer. It wasn't hate that stopped her from reading it. It was disinterest. There was nothing in his words that could undo what had been done, and more importantly, there was nothing in them she needed. Later that night, she burned the letter in the fireplace, not out of anger, but as a ritual of closure. The past had spoken. She had answered. Now it was time to keep walking forward. By summer, the scriptorium had become more than a retreat. It was a community. Past residents stayed in touch, forming writing groups and supporting each other online. One launched her own podcast, another secured a book deal. Eleanor watched with pride as their voices echoed out into the world. She hosted small reunions, inviting women back for a weekend of celebration and shared readings. At one such gathering, they surprised her with a gift, a framed print made up of phrases from their stories, arranged to form a tree. "You gave us roots," they said. Eleanor cried quietly, holding the frame to her chest. It now hung in the entryway, the first thing anyone saw when they walked through the door. One night, after a particularly moving reading, Eleanor sat on the back porch, legs curled beneath her, tea in hand. The stars above her seemed impossibly wide. She remembered how small she had felt once, inside her marriage, inside her silence. And she remembered the sharp click of the front door closing behind Victor for the last time. That sound, once terrifying, now played in her mind like music. "He left," she whispered to the sky. "And I found everything he never saw in me." The stars shimmered above as if in agreement. In that quiet moment she felt utterly whole, not because someone completed her, but because she had completed herself. Her second book was released that fall. A novel this time, centered around a woman who creates a sanctuary for storytellers in the woods. Though fictional, readers could feel the truth humming beneath each line. The reviews were glowing. Critics praised its warmth, its tenderness, and the way it wrapped grief in layers of gentle strength. It made the bestseller list by the end of October. But what meant more to Eleanor than any accolade was a letter from a teenager in rural Montana. "Your book made me feel like I could make it out. I don't know how yet, but now I think I might." Eleanor placed that letter beside the first print copy of her book on her writing shelf. Some words deserved a home. By the time winter returned, Eleanor had expanded the scriptorium's programming. She began offering virtual mentorships and weekend workshops. A former resident suggested opening a scholarship fund for women who couldn't afford travel or time away. Eleanor loved the idea. With the help of her publisher and a few generous donors, the Right to Rise Fund was born. That year alone, it sponsored 9 women, each with stories more complex and resilient than the last. Eleanor felt the seed she once planted was now a garden, not of pain but of power, not of revenge but restoration. A garden where truth was both the soil and the bloom. In December, a film producer reached out. She had read both of Eleanor's books and proposed adapting the memoir into a limited series. "It's not about scandal," the woman insisted. "It's about evolution. About voice." Eleanor agreed to a meeting and by the end of it, felt something she hadn't expected: peace with the idea. She would stay involved as a consultant but insisted the focus remain on truth, dignity, and the ripple effect of courage. "The show won't make you a star," the producer warned, "but it might make others feel seen." "That's the only thing I want," Eleanor said. And she meant it. That Christmas, Eleanor hosted dinner at the scriptorium. Her parents came along with Nina and a few close friends. They sat around a long wooden table, candles flickering between them, and shared food and stories and joy. At one point her father raised a glass. "To Eleanor," he said, voice thick. "You gave your pain a purpose. And in doing so, you gave all of us hope." Eleanor blinked fast, heart full. "To all of us," she replied. "Because we write each other forward." Glasses clinked gently. In the warmth of laughter and the hush of snowfall outside, Eleanor realized she was exactly where she belonged. Later that night, long after the dishes were done and the guests had gone, Eleanor sat by the fireplace with a fresh journal in her lap. She opened it to the first page and wrote, "This is the beginning of chapter 3. Not because she was closing a door, but because new ones were opening, ones she had built herself. She didn't know what this chapter would hold. Maybe more writing, maybe another book, maybe something else entirely. But she was ready. Because the woman who once stayed silent had become someone who could build sanctuaries from ashes. She closed the journal and whispered, "Let's begin." The new year arrived quietly. Eleanor stood on the dock behind the scriptorium as the sun broke through the mist, painting the lake in soft gold. She wrapped herself in a wool shawl, fingers curled around a warm mug, and closed her eyes. This was the first January in decades that didn't begin with someone else's agenda. No hospital schedules. No parties to plan. No masking resentment with polished smiles. Just her breath, her body, and her life. She reflected on the woman she once was, the version who tiptoed around someone else's moods, who questioned her own instincts. "You did the best you could," she whispered to that past self. "And now I'm doing better." Eleanor's life was not perfect. There were still lonely moments, still questions about what could have been. Sometimes she missed having someone to share evening tea with, or to debrief the strange details of her day. But she never missed him. Not the silence between them. Not the performative affection. Not the feeling of being erased one subtle remark at a time. She had replaced those things with presence, with women who spoke from the gut, with books that healed, and with work that mattered. She no longer feared solitude. In fact, she had come to cherish it. "Being alone isn't empty," she once told her therapist. "It's spacious." When the scriptorium marked its 1-year anniversary, Eleanor hosted a reading unlike any other. Past residents flew in from all over, some now published, others still scribbling their truths on napkins and late-night emails. They filled the house with laughter, courage, and words that once trembled. Eleanor stood at the front of the room and read a new piece, something different from her usual work. It was a letter, this time one she had written. "Dear self," it began. "You didn't break. You bloomed. I'm proud of you. Not for surviving but for becoming." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Eleanor didn't need the noise. The knowing inside her was loud enough. By then, The Day the Curtain Fell had been translated into 8 languages. Her second novel was optioned for film. And the scriptorium had a 2-year waitlist. But Eleanor didn't measure success by numbers. She measured it by the silence broken at her fireplace, by the manuscripts left behind on worn desks, by the woman who once whispered, "I can't write anymore," now shouting her story on stages. That was the legacy. Not fame. Not a clean narrative. But truth. Raw, powerful, and alive. Eleanor continued writing, not because she had to, but because it was her way of breathing. On the evening of her 21st wedding anniversary, Eleanor walked the garden path alone. The same path she had once taken in a silk gown toward a man full of secrets. Now, she wore soft linen and carried nothing but a journal and a pen. She reached the arbor where she had once stood with trembling hands and broken trust, and she sat on the bench beneath it. The roses had grown thicker now, the vines stronger. She opened her journal and began to write, not about endings but about what came after. The wind rustled the pages. The sun dipped low. And in the hush between light and dark, Eleanor Grant, writer, teacher, builder, survivor, began again.